Hello, everyone. Welcome, those of you online. Now I'm apparently in frame. We are thrilled today at this week's Cyber Policy Center lunch to have my colleague from the law school, Julian Nyarko. Julian's been with us for 3 years now? Yeah, 3 to 4 years now. We're thrilled to have him. And this paper that he's going to be talking about today and his research surrounding it, I think shows the breadth of his experience and research agenda in that it's talking about how Facebook is used by law enforcement and what the sort of downstream bias and effects of that are. But Julian does so much more in the areas of, he teaches contracts law, he teaches a class on sort of helping lawyers to read scientific studies, does all kinds of work on NLP and other tech related to, whether it's contracts or other data sets. And so we are thrilled to have you today to join us here for the Cyber Policy Center lunch. Those of you on Zoom can put in questions into the Q&A, which will then be forwarded to me. Julian will talk for about a half an hour or so, and then we'll have questions both from the room and those online, and he and I will sit in front and we'll have a conversation. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nate. Well, if that's for me, thank you, but also thank you, Nate. So I'm going to talk about a paper called Police Agencies on Facebook Overreporting on Black Suspects, recently published, at least by sort of social science standards, right? Maybe not computer science. It's co-authored work with Ben Grunwald at Duke University and John Rappaport at the University of Chicago. And so just to give you sort of the executive summary, what we do, what we find. So in essence, we collect Facebook posts by police departments and the Facebook pages and the Facebook posts. And then for each police department that has a Facebook page, we compare how often the department talks about crimes committed by black suspects to how often black suspects actually, or black people actually commit crimes on the ground in the jurisdiction of the police departments. And what we find is that police departments across the US post disproportionately about black crime, and that Facebook users disproportionately see posts about black crime. All right, so let's, with that, take a step back. What is the motivation for us to study this? So we know that the vast majority of Americans doesn't really look at statistics and data to get a sense of the interaction of crime and race, but rather they look at crime news reports. And suspect race is a particularly salient feature in those crime news reports. So there have been experimental studies, my favorite one here I cite below, where they basically put people up in these little fake living rooms, and then they showed them crime news, and they randomly varied the race of the suspect that was reported on in the crime news. And what they have shown is that there's actual real consequence to how people imagine the interaction of crime and race to take place. So for instance, when people saw a black suspect in those crime news, they were more likely to support a Republican in upcoming elections, and also they were more likely to support more punitive policies. Okay, so how people think about crime and race actually has policy consequences. Now, traditionally, of course, crime news were mostly included in newspapers, local newspapers in particular, and there have been a bunch of studies on how these traditional media report on crime and race. The evidence, I would say, is inconsistent. So some studies find that there is overreporting on minority crimes. Some studies find that there's no problem. And this is likely due to just heterogeneity. In some jurisdictions, in some geographic areas, there's a bigger problem. In others, there isn't. And those were all usually local studies. Now, with social media, we have sort of this new way for the police to directly communicate with the public, right? Whereas in traditional media, you have sort of a gatekeeper, an editor, who selects what news to report on social media, police can directly communicate. There's no gatekeeper, and we also have much larger volume, right? So to the extent that we are sort of concerned about geographic heterogeneity, this is something we can actually explore if we move to social media. Okay, so Facebook, or now Meta, encourages police departments to use its platform, right? Here we show a screenshot from sort of a leaflet that is online, which instructs police departments on how they should use the platform to have a lot of engagement and to attract users. And one of the recommendations is to post crime news on their Facebook sites. What am I talking about when I talk about crime news reports? So here you see one example by the Boston Police Department. So you see sort of, right, it's probably pretty small for you, but a pretty detailed report about a crime that happened. And among the details that it contains is a suspect description that includes the description of the suspect race. So for instance, here, if you would read it carefully, it would say, an unknown black male entered the rear of his motor vehicle, pulled out a firearm, and pointed it at the victim before demanding the victim's cell phone and cash. So this is sort of the type of crime report that we're studying in this paper. Okay, with that, let's talk about the data. So I told you that essentially we're comparing how police talks about crime and race to the interaction of crime and race on the ground, right? And it turns out each of these quantities corresponds to one data set that we're using. So in order to figure out how police talks about crime and race on these platforms, we turn to CrowdTangle, which is a website that tracks and makes available to the public social media content. It was purchased by Facebook in 2016. And through CrowdTangle, we pull all publicly available posts of these police departments. And then to get a sense of what happens on the ground, turn among others to what's called the Uniform Crime Report. So the FBI maintains that database, and it asks police departments to continuously, on a monthly basis, ideally, report, among others, arrest statistics, and so including the arrestees' race. And so we know, the share of black people among the arrestees from that data. There's a lot of sort of debate about among criminologists on the quality of this data set, but I'll tell you in a second. So we're basically looking at the highest quality part of that data set. Not every agency does report, as you'll see in a minute. So in particular in Florida and in Illinois, agencies tend to just not do it. And so they are not part of our analysis. The time frame we're considering is January 1st, 2010, all the way through December 31st, 2019. Ultimately, we match 13,000, roughly, agency pages, which we have geolocated, to their Facebook pages. And we're confident through the way we do this that we have the universe of all agency pages for police departments that actually report crime statistics, right? So some police departments don't report crime statistics, they're not part of it. But if they report statistics, arrest statistics, and we don't find a Facebook page for them, we're confident that they don't have a Facebook page. Okay, just to give you a sense of how to think about the population that we're really studying. We pull all posts, several million of them, and finally we subset to roughly 100,000 race crime posts, and then we further subset to the 70,000 posts that involve a serious Part 1 offense. So that goes back to sort of the data quality issue. The more serious crimes are reported more reliably in the UCR, and those include murder, aggravated assault, rape, robbery, theft, auto theft, and burglary, I think. Overall, we also have the metadata for these posts, followers, shares, and so on and so forth. We estimate that these posts roughly generate 200 million exposures, and we observe that they generated 11 million shares overall. Okay, because I have a little bit more time, I'll just say, in case this is interesting, how do we identify race crime posts? So in a different paper with different co-authors, we developed an algorithm that automatically redacts police reports, which is used in two DA's offices in California right now. So the idea is a police report comes in, and there are certain racial cues like names and race descriptions and clothing and so on and so forth that this algorithm automatically redacts, and then the prosecutors make charging decisions based on the redacted police report. And this is something that, I don't know if you've heard, there's a new law in California that by 2025, all prosecutors' offices are supposed to do that with the police reports, which is just to say, this is a pretty reliable algorithm that is actually used in practice. So this is how we identify what poses a crime report, contains a race description. And then among those, we label 1,000 posts, roughly 1,990, for different things we're interested in, among others, whether it is a crime report, whether there was an arrest reported, what the type of the crime is. And then we train several machine learning classifiers. This is all pre-chat GPT, and so we're still using BERT models for those who sort of are in that space a little bit, transformer-based models. Generally, sometimes some other algorithms perform better, and then for rape, we actually just use a simple keyword approach because the offense we care about is very particular. So if you have a sexual offense, it's often the case that the posts contain very few details, and we're very uncertain what type of offense it was. And so we're actually looking for keywords such as rape and so on and so forth in the crime post to make sure that we're getting it right. Okay, with that, let's turn to the analysis. So we start with overreporting, right? And we ask the question, do police agencies overreport on black crime? And so what we do is pretty straightforward, right? We just look at what is the share of black suspects among the arrestees, and then compare that to what is the share of black suspects in the posts. And so if a police agency has 50% black arrestees and reports 50% on black crime, then that overreporting score would be 0. If we have 20% black arrestees, but 66% black suspects in posts, then that police agency would overreport by 46%. And we can also have reporting, right? So it's pretty straightforward what overreporting is. And if we just look at, so every police agency gets this overreporting score from us, and then we're averaging over all police agencies to get these results that you're seeing here. So the way to read this is on the x-axis, you see the proportion of black suspects, right? And sort of this hollow circle says in arrests, and the solid dot is in Facebook posts, right? And so that across crime categories, so each row is a different crime category. Across crime categories, we have more black suspects in posts. The share of black suspects in posts is higher than the share of black arrestees, and it's pretty significant. If you look at all crimes, it's in the average agency, 20% of arrestees are black, but in the average agency, 32% of suspects that are reported on are black. So, this is quite problematic, but you might say, oh, Julian, this is bad, but you might have some concerns, right? Maybe all the overreporting, for instance, is done by some remote agency, and no one sees the posts of that agency, for instance, right? Or the other one is they're making is that every person looks at the posts of their own police agency, but maybe they also look at posts by neighboring police agencies. And so what we do, the vast majority of what we actually do in the paper is to shift the focus towards what we call overexposure, right? So this was just, overreporting is about sort of what does the police department do? Overexposure is about what is the actual effect on people, our best estimate, our best guess for the effect on Facebook users of the practice of the police department. And so we have several analyses. One that we're using tries to account for geography. So you saw previously this picture, right? And now the idea of what we're doing now is just to say, hey, if you are in a certain jurisdiction, you're not only seeing Facebook posts by your own police department, but maybe also by neighboring police departments. And the further geographically you are away from the police department that posts about crimes, the less likely you are to see this, right? And this is based on estimates where people say that most people on Facebook have, for instance, friends in a 100-mile radius across their actual location, and so their friends share content. There's some chance that they also see that content, and there's some chance that you just follow the neighboring police department's posts, right? And so what we're doing is, as we calculate the share of black suspects in posts, we are also assigning some weight to posts by neighboring police departments, right? And the weight decreases the further the police department is away, right? So here we say, as we compare in the first column here, and I'll go back into the frame in a second. In the first column, when we compare, when we calculate the share of black suspects in posts by that police department, we say, well, there's some chance that you also see posts of the second police department, which reports, overreports 66%, and some chance that you see the posts by the third police department, but the third one is further away, 35 miles, than the first one, so then the second one, so the second one gets more weight. Right? And so we try different decay parameters in the paper. So we're saying there are different ways in which we discount posts that are far away as we calculate that quantity. But yeah, just to give you this sense, compare the share of black suspects in the first police department's post, we would say, okay, the 66% from the police department number 2 also gets some weight that is inversely related distance, and from the third one as well. So I hope you get the general thing, geographic overexposure. Is the mic okay? I feel like, okay. Yeah, and so if we calculate overexposure to black suspects or to police department posts in this way, it actually turns out that the gap is even greater, right? And so you see this on the left side, where roughly 18% of RSTs are black. That number is a little bit smaller, because we can calculate overexposure also for agencies that don't have Facebook pages. And then overreporting is, I think, 38%, right? And so if you do the math, it's all, in relative terms, it's almost 200% overreporting, overexposure for the average Facebook user to posts that involve black suspects. Okay. We also do similar things. We also get similar results if we weigh by other quantities. So you might say, weigh by the number of followers that an agency has, or by the population share, or post interactions. But no matter how we slice it and dice it, we always get this, with the exception of auto theft. So auto theft is a little bit more unclear. We don't have as much statistical power there, but other than that, pretty consistently get overexposure. We can also break these results down by geography, right? So here you see a heat map where yellow to red indicates that Facebook users in that region are estimated by us to be overexposed to black suspect crime news. And everything that's blue, there's underexposure. And every small black dot that you see is the location of a police department, police agency that we're studying. And if you look very carefully, you'll see Illinois, Florida, very few black dots because few police departments report. But you see that overexposure is basically ubiquitous across the United States. In some parts of southern states, it's not a problem. Those very high black population shares, so those regions called the Black Belt region, but other than that, it's basically everywhere. This is a plot that we have a similar plot in the paper, but this is from The Economist, which then took our data and made a better plot, where we're breaking down the overexposure by ideology. So each dot here is a county, and they're sized based on population. So larger dot means higher population share. And so this is on the x-axis you see the mean share for Republican the mean share of Republican votes over the 2012 and 2016 elections. And so what you can see is that as we move to the right of this plot, overexposure becomes a bigger problem. So it's more pronounced in Republican voting counties than Democrat voting counties. You know, one potential confounding factor is that Democratic counties tend to have a higher population share of black residents. So we can also break this down. This is now from our paper, and you see the difference in quality, right? So here on the x-axis, we have the share of the black population. Red is Republican voting. Blue is Democratic voting. And so you see that even given the same share of black population, Republican voting counties overexpose their youth more to crime by black people than Democratic counties. Now, what are the takeaways? Well, first of all, we find that police departments overreport on black suspects, and they also overexpose their users to crime committed by black suspects. It's geographically virtually ubiquitous and more pronounced in majority Republican counties. Now, it's important to mention that one thing we don't do in the paper is we don't in depth investigate the reasons for why there is overexposure, right? Sort of there's sort of, right, one possible explanation is it is racial animus, discriminatory intent, and police departments just want to, consciously or subconsciously want to report more on crimes committed by black suspects. But you can also have more complicated stories, right? You can say, oh, maybe police departments like sensationalist crimes, and it's more sensationalist if a crime is committed at night, and maybe black suspects are more likely to commit crimes at night. And so there's no, there's no discriminatory intent involved here. It's just a consequence of, some more pure motive. As a consequence, the burden is carried by the minority, by the black community here, right? And so there are sort of legal theories that correspond to these ideas of discrimination. There's the theory of disparate treatment, which is sort of what we traditionally think about as discrimination. Someone, imposes a cost on a black person because of their race. But then there's also disparate impact, where we're saying, I have some policy in place. The policy, it turns out, much of the burden is carried by the black community, and then the key question is there any justification for having that policy, right? So one example is from the National Police Department. The National Police Department tends to stop people for minor traffic infractions. And the idea was, if we stop people for minor traffic infractions, we will prevent more serious crimes further down the road because people know that we're around. But most of the people who were stopped were black, right, in the National Police Department. And so then the question becomes, is this so even if the police department doesn't systematically stop minority suspects, black suspects, right? We have this policy in place, stopping for minor traffic infractions. Most of the burden is carried by the black community. And then the question is there any justification for that? Right? Police department says we want to prevent serious crime. It turns out an analysis reveals you don't prevent serious crime, right? So there is no justification and you should stop. And so the rationale we are applying here is similar. We're saying, okay, we have this policy in place, right? Reporting on minority crime, including race descriptions. And can we think of any justification for doing that, right? And so there might be some. If you're really concerned about public safety, you might say, hey, I want, these race descriptions help us catch suspects, right? And if you haven't shown me that there's no racial animus involved, then maybe this is a justifiable policy. Well, to which we would respond, right? Maybe if you are that concerned about public safety, then maybe there's some social benefit to have race descriptions for really sort of important crimes like murder when a suspect is at large. But what we find is even if we just subset to posts that just report on an arrest, so there's no sort of investigatory value to the post, we see this drastic problem. It's basically the same, right? Then you might say, oh, but the public should be informed. Maybe there's an information value. Also that, we have statistics that are more reliable than crime news reports. And it's also, a question of whether there's any social value to try to know more about the interaction of race and crime. But in any event, we sort of go through, we do our thinking, and where we land on is it's probably hard to come up with a justification for including race descriptions in crime posts unless it's a very serious crime and the suspect is at large. There probably is very little value, and so potentially with the exception of this narrow context, we probably shouldn't have race descriptions in these crime reports at all. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Well, yeah, here, I'll turn this one on for you. Well, that was wonderful. I mean, there's so much food for thought there. And I've got lots of sort of data questions, and people should raise their hands if they do. But I want to, since we probably have some Facebook people on who are watching this, and you're looking at Facebook data, what would you recommend to them? Is there something that a platform should do based on the sort of findings of your paper that you think might be, a way of ameliorating some of this bias in reporting?
Yeah, so we have talked to folks from Facebook at different occasions, or Meta, sorry, and I do think one thing that can be done is there are reasonably good connections with law enforcement agencies, and so the first part that can be done is just to raise awareness, right? As I said, it's not necessarily the case that there's racial animus. Many police departments might not even be aware of what they're doing. In fact, some police departments reach out to us and ask, what does it look for? What does it look like for us, right? It's our jurisdictional problem. And so we do think awareness is, relying on existing channels and connections, and raising awareness is sort of one thing that can be done. There are also more complicated technical solutions. So what we have done, this overexposure analysis, is something that Facebook Meta could easily do itself, and identify maybe police departments for whom sort of the overreporting is most drastic, and then do sort of a more targeted information, saying, hey, we analyzed your posts over the last X years. There might be a problem. Maybe you want to review. So that's one thing that. Where the platform, Facebook itself, Meta, could do something.
So one thing they could do, and this now goes into the data, is something based on how viral these posts are, and how the algorithm then amplifies, sort of adds amplification to the victimization here, right? So that they do you have any sense as to whether posts by police agencies that are about black arrestees that mention race end up getting more either engagement or forwarding or anything like that?
Yeah, so they get more engagement than the average post of police departments, but there's some restrictions on what we know about other crime posts, for instance. So one thing we don't have as a quantity, and this is sort of this goes in the NLP, natural language processing details, is crime posts that don't even involve a race description. So it would be nice to compare, crime posts that involve a race description to those that don't, for instance. So these types of quantities we don't have, but we know that there's sort of more likes, more shares if it's a race crime post compared to other posts that agencies do. And as you suggest, right, one approach would be to sort of deprioritize how you show these posts.
So the police departments that are mentioning the race of black suspects, so they're over-reporting, as compared to the actual crimes, they're over-reporting the black share of, the posts suggest that they're over-reporting on black crime. Are they, can you divide police departments up in the country as those that frequently are putting race into their posts and those that don't? So part of where I'm trying to get at is that, and this is not to explain it away, it's trying to get a sense as to whether the practice of putting race in there, sort of what you're talking about with California, are these posts, are they over-reporting on are they always reporting race and they're just sort of leaving out some of the non-black arrestees, or are they only sort of reporting race when there's a black arrestee?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So the question is, what about crime posts that don't involve any race description at all, right? Can we?
Well, maybe there's that, but I'm just trying to figure out whether they are. Some police departments, maybe following kind of the California model, are not putting race into these posts, and some are obsessed with race, and so they always want to put it in there. And then some are just racist, and so they're putting in the black, they're over-reporting on black crime, right?
That would require us to know crime posts that don't even involve a race description, and so that specific analysis we currently can't do. So let me just talk about the sort of technical limitation. We first identify crime posts, race descriptions. We first identify race descriptions with our algorithm, and then among the posts that contain race descriptions, we identify crime posts. The reason is that when you train a machine learning classifier, you want to take a random sample and then label that, right? Now, if we don't subset to race descriptions first using the existing algorithm, it's sort of a needle in the haystack problem. We would probably have to hand label, 50,000 posts to get enough examples, because police departments post so much about other things as well, right? We would need to hand label 50,000 or something posts in order to get posts that are crime posts but don't involve a race description. And so it was just the three of us and a couple of RAs. We couldn't do it, but for future work, and especially if we have more outside help labeling, that's something that's definitely worth investigating.
Do you have a sense? The descriptive statistics are really jarring. I mean, I think that this is a very significant finding. What's the range look like here a little bit? So are there just some really bad police departments with lots of posts where it is so overrepresented? What you show is how ubiquitous this is. That's in some ways, I don't know whether that's depressing or optimistic, and that it's happening all over the place. But what is the? I mean, there must be like real bad actors here that you may have found out. I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about where you could point
so we decided early on to
not to do that,
not to really do that, because we have a sort of over-reporting score for every police agency, but if you look at individual scores, many agencies actually don't have that many posts, and so there's a lot of sort of statistical noise. That said, that we can identify police departments that both post a lot and have a lot of over-reporting, so where we're really confident. But we
is there any regional story there at all?
We haven't investigated.
I mean, what's really interesting is the black belt story also that you show, which is that as the share of the population increases in share is black, then there's less over-reporting. Right. Which could suggest all kinds of. I mean, there's the political explanation when you've got the sort of Democrats and Republicans, but there's also, who's in charge of the police department, right? And that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so we look at what we do in the paper, in the appendix. We look at the share, maybe that's even on the slides. I forgot where they put it. But we look at the share of black sworn police officers in the department and see whether that might explain the patterns we see. But we see no relationship. So the idea is, right, if you have more black officers on the force, maybe you overreport less, but that is not the case. So that's analysis we do.
What would be the next step here? Do you want to continue? This is a huge project. What would be the next chapter?
So there are two things, right? One is sort of digging into the explanations. We just do sort of, we look at ideology, we look at black population share, we look at officer race. That explains some of what we're seeing, but it's still not a formal causal analysis, right? So there's sort of a lot of work to be done to figure out, why do Republican voting counties overreport more, right? There, for instance, on that finding alone, there are different theories. There's a theory that says, if you overreport the public more, overexpose the public more to black crime, they're more likely to support Republican candidates, but also Republican candidates, are racially often more conservative, and so maybe there's not as much concern about balance, and that produces then these disparities that we're seeing. And so there's sort of many investigations on that front. And then another dimension we think is important, and colleagues here at Stanford are working on this actually, is looking at other social media channels. So Nextdoor is particularly interesting because on Nextdoor, right, it's regular people and their surroundings sort of posting about crime and what they see through their Ring cameras and so on and so forth. And so they're investigating sort of whether we see a similar phenomenon on Nextdoor.
Do you have any sense of whether this reporting, is there a Facebook story here, or is this an overreporting story? And by that I mean, or is it a social media story? If you were to look at newspapers, and I get, this is a typical kind of question when I present a paper I hate. It's like, oh, here's this huge amount of work you could do. But do we think that they create a post and then it goes out to all kinds of different channels, legacy versus social media, that you think you'd probably see the same thing with respect to local police blotters and things like that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we do, and one concerning thing is that local newspapers often just directly copy Facebook posts, right? And so we talked to a couple of newspapers. Some are more aware of the issue and select specifically and say, we don't want to overreport, and so we're doing some selection there to sort of counteract what the police does. But others are just directly copy pasting, whatever post they find interesting. And so it's sort of interesting where, traditionally it was the case that the police report something, media selects, and then sort of can mitigate. Now there's more of a, for many local news outlets, there's sort of, whatever the police reports goes through directly to the public, and the media outlet sort of as an amplifier rather than a filter. And so, there's just a lot of heterogeneity. We talked to a couple of outlets again who are more sort of aware, and then others are not.
Of newspaper outlets, you're saying? Well, and with the conversations that you had with the police departments that came to, I'm sort of interested in how that developed. They saw your article and said, and contacted you, and what was this like a teachable moment? What did it look like when you would talk to these police departments?
So police departments vary a lot in how big they are. 50% of police departments in the US have 10 or less or fewer officers. And larger police departments do have media communication specialists, and those typically are the ones who have reached out to us. And it was interesting. They want to know what's going on locally with their police department. In one example, the communications expert said, we're actually concerned about this problem. We have been before, and so we have a policy in place whereby we only include race in very particular circumstances, and so we want to know whether we're on the overreporting side or not. And so that police department wasn't overreporting on race, which is at least anecdotal evidence that maybe these internal policies that police departments have can help sort of counteract this overexposure problem. But then, yeah, some of them, yeah, just have overexposure and then often, or overreporting, then the communication stops. We also heard from citizens who took our findings to the police departments and said, I noticed, I see so many black suspects in your post, what's going on there? And then there the reaction was more defensive. So
Sure.
that was, surely these Stanford professors haven't studied our police department.
Right.
And so, yeah.
We all get that. Is there any difference over time? You've got about a 10-year period here, right? Is it pretty consistent throughout? I mean, I suppose that Facebook itself develops over that time period, so you're just seeing rocketing up in at least the number of posts over time.
Yeah, so we don't see large differences other than the number of posts, sort of in overreporting patterns, but we are not, once you slice it into years, statistical power decreases, and so it becomes harder to really, say something definitive.
Yeah. Are any questions from the floor here, Elena? Wait for your mic to come to you.
This may be too much cause for speculation, but do you anticipate, or did you see at all kind of coded racial language in districts that are not directly reporting, this is the criminal race is black? Like, did you see that yet, or do you anticipate seeing it more as departments choose to pull off from identifying people directly by race?
Yeah, that's interesting. So we haven't looked at it, but this algorithm we do have developed would allow us to examine some of that. So, hairstyles, for instance, and clothing can often be sort of these types of cues. And it's something that we could look at. We haven't done that yet, but yeah, it's sort of an interesting path to pursue.
That raises an interesting question on how how you are identifying race, because you talked about that in the talk, but what kind of word? So obviously, literally words like black and white are going to be picked up, but what else is being picked up because it's much more over inclusive than that, right?
It's actually not that much more over inclusive.
Okay,
It's if you have a word like black, then the question is, does it describe the color of a car in a crime? A crime, or is it meant to identify skin color? And so they're sort of the bigger problem, but it is, we look for specific race descriptions such as black, African American. We also, we have other race descriptions, Caucasian, white, Asian, and so on and so forth, but those are really, we're looking for really explicit race descriptions here. So it's not much more sophisticated than that.
Daphne.
For racial disparities in media reporting on crime, presumably audience demand is part of that, like what sells newspapers. And similarly for platform algorithmic targeting, audience demand is part of it. Is this a situation, what you've studied, like pure supply side racism scenario that gives us a useful contrast, or how does demand fit in here?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, right? So we discussed that a little bit in the paper. There's sort of a supply side story. There's a demand side story. Again, sort of with the constrained space that we have, we can't really go into depth. One analysis we did is we looked at whether election cycles are predictive, which would speak to a demand side story, right? And we find that those are not predictive of how much overreporting there is. But for many of the patterns we see, even the ideology story, there's a demand side story that Republican voters like to see more minority crime posts, and that's why they exist. Or there's a supply side story, and so that's sort of also one angle for future research, sort of how to disentangle these mechanisms. Yeah.
Is there a large, like you talked about before, about the small police, that most police departments are small. Mm-hmm. But I suppose there's so size of the police department is one metric. Professionalism is maybe another one. Is there some story about heterogeneity about the size of the police department here, urban, rural, those kinds of things that would explain different behaviors or likelihood of mentioning race?
Yeah, I recall we looked at size, not in the paper, but if I recall correctly, size was not largely predictive. However, sort of what we were interested in is sort of this professionalism angle. So you can ask, do police departments have a dedicated media person that sort of selects these Facebook posts? Now, that information hasn't, as far as we know, hasn't been collected at scale, but it would be interesting to know, right? And so this
is the kind of thing we do in the election area, right? Where, because the same phenomenon happens, it turns out like, I think it's roughly half of the jurisdictions in the U.S. do not have any full-time election administrators, right? But by counties, half the counties,
right.
And it's like it's the notary or whatever that does this, and it's like, but Los Angeles is a completely different, apparatus than someplace in the middle of the country. Let me ask you about the the different crimes also. So one way to ask this question is, what's up with auto theft? Which is like, why is that? So is it that there's not as many in your data set? Because there isn't a whole lot of difference between reporting and actuality. Is it? And do you have any theories about why the overreporting might be bigger in some crimes and not others?
So I don't have anything very smart to say on that point. Or many other points.
No.
But no. So it's not statistical significance. So we're quite our estimates for rape. The estimates are pretty noisy because police doesn't report that often, and we have a very narrow definition of what or the UCR has a narrow definition of what rape is. But auto theft. So it's not necessarily statistical significance. So yeah, we're not quite sure what's going on there.
I mean, I'm trying to think if there's any reason that you would expect there to be over-reporting on race in some types of crimes as opposed to others. Because then, I mean, is it possible that there is the likelihood of reporting race, just reporting race? Well, actually, you might not know this, right?
Yeah, we don't know this.
You don't know if you're more likely to report race in the case of, person-to-person violent crimes,
right,
as compared to property crimes or something like that.
Yeah, no, this all requires sort of knowing what a crime post is without a race description, which is what we don't currently have. But, if we can throw more resources on this, those are exactly the type of questions that we would want to explore.
I'm really eager to see if you follow up with a next door study on this, and you can talk to some of the folks in the Stanford Internet Observatory who've done some work on Nextdoor. I can only imagine. I just watched. Has anyone watched Beef? This new show on Netflix, which is like, I don't know. It's staying with me, but it all starts with a road rage incident that then is filmed on Nextdoor, and then the next 10 episodes explain what happens. Anyway, on that, totally. Let me talk to Maricha. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. Fascinating research. Two questions. Do you know of other studies that have looked at other race or ethnic descriptions to compare whether it's the same for Black as, for example, I don't know, like Asian or other ethnicities? And then have you looked at other countries to see whether this is a typical American phenomenon, or do you know of people who've studied it so that you can compare a little bit?
Yeah, so the answer to both is sort of no. So the problem is, so I don't know of a study that sort of extracts that information internationally. I'm from Germany. And I think, so in Germany, it's very hard to get these types of arrest statistics, right? Or also we look at incident statistics that involve race or ethnicity descriptions. And then, so we ourselves, we can look at Asian and Asian American suspects. But there are much fewer incidents, so this is all very, very noisy. And so it's very hard to tell something. One interesting, it would be interesting to be able to also study ethnicity and especially whether there's overreporting on Hispanic crime. The problem is that the UCR is quite inconsistent in how it reports on ethnicity. So some police departments specifically report on ethnicity and whether the arrestee is Hispanic. Some don't and just usually report white. And so this is not something we can do in this analysis with the current, the way the data is currently tracked. But yeah, it's something that would be nice to look into, for sure.
Great. Well, yes, last question over here.
This is a fantastic study. I'm interested in maybe connecting the dots to over-policing in black neighborhoods, and I'm wondering if the data has arrest location in any of the posts, if you've looked at any of that, and otherwise how else to get some of this information to police reformers at municipal levels.
Yeah, we don't have specific locations of the arrests in the UCR. I know some data sets have these arrest statistics and the specific location, incidence location. So I think New York data, there's New York data that has that specific. So one could do, it's definitely worthwhile to do sort of a geographically more limited analysis that then involves the specific location. I think, so I'm working a lot with another co-author in the sort of algorithmic criminal justice space, and I think we have a data set for Chicago as well with a specific incident. So, you know, if those are larger sort of metropolitan areas, this is something one could do specifically when they're linked up to those data sets, but yeah, not across the entire US. So there, the data is too limited.
Please join me in thanking Julian Nyarko.
Thank you so much.
We have Michal Kosinski, who's talking about theory of mind may have spontaneously emerged in large language, I assume, models, but maybe it's large language. This is, the answer may surprise you. Come next week and find